Part 11. Reina Beldrin, the girl smiled. It is nice to see that the rumors were so wrong about you. The guy nodded. Some had you with two heads and a tail. They all laughed, and I felt Jonathan's grip tighten a bit on mine. I turned a bit and looked behind me. I knew I forgot something in the car, I stated, and they threw their heads back and laughed. I smiled. They didn't smell like Pack, but the werewolf scent did relax me a bit. They were also older than my clique, but they were very friendly, and soon I pulled my hand out of Jonathan's and started to talk more relaxed. A lady walked up behind the bar and the man turned. "Two more, please," he stated, holding up his empty glass. She nodded and turned, and I gasped. I took a step back and went stiff. Jonathan eyed me and the others went quiet. He looked up at the bartender, who was a little paler than a werewolf would normally be. He turned back to me. "Do you know her?" My head shook. I thought I... He frowned and turned me away from the others. "What is it?" I shrugged, having to lean into his ear. "I thought you said there were only vampires and werewolves here tonight." He nodded. "Yes, the bartender is a wolf." "Mostly," I stated, and he stiffened. He looked over my shoulder and signaled to a large man. "What else is she?" I shivered and tried to unclench my hands. "She's part human," I whispered, and his face tightened with anger. He waved another of the massive vampires over and leaned into the man's ear. The man nodded and left. A moment later I heard some arguing behind me, but Jonathan held my shoulders, keeping my back to what was happening and watching me. "I'm fine," I whispered. I just didn't expect it." He shook his head. "I had no idea. She is registered as a full wolf." "The scent is very light," I stated. "She might not even know." He looked up over my shoulder and then nodded. "She's gone." I nodded back and then turned, worried about the looks I might get now. But the others started up the conversation where it left off, and I was grateful for that. Suddenly the music changed. A slower song played, and Tanya turned to me. I balked, and Jonathan laughed. "Sorry, Tanya. This song is all mine." I frowned in confusion as he walked me towards the dance floor. "She's straight, but here it's no big deal for females to dance together," he explained as he stepped out onto the floor that was now less crowded than it had been. I had seen as much in movies on TV, but it was still odd to see it in real life. Jonathan stopped in front of me and smiled. I looked down at our feet and then shrugged. He sighed theatrically and took my hands, putting them behind his neck. Then he put his around my waist. "Just listen to the music," he stated as he pulled me closer. I looked to the side, since he was too tall for me to really look over his shoulder. Allison waved at me, with one arm still around Joel's neck. Joel winked, and I grinned. I did listen to the music and found it was very easy to follow the slow steps. It did remind me of the packed drums, though, and I found my mind wandering a bit. "Something wrong?" Jonathan whispered into my ear. I shook my head, and he looked around. "Then dare I be brave enough to say that you might, just might, mind you, be having a good time?" I chuckled but didn't answer. He smiled and kept dancing. For some reason, the next song was a slower song too. When I stood back from him, he shook his head. Suddenly, another guy walked out onto the dance floor and made his way over to us. He was blond, several inches shorter than Jonathan, but more muscular, and, I inhaled slowly, he was a werewolf. "Can I cut in, or are you hogging her all to yourself?" the wolf asked, smiling. Jonathan pulled me to him. "Sorry, Nick. She's all mine." The guy shook his head. It's not right, you know. Bringing her here, taunting all of us guys, and then keeping her to yourself. Jonathan chuckled and looked down at me. Reina, this is Nick. Hi, I said softly, but smiling. It was nice to smell wolves around me, pack or not. Other people were dancing around us, and Jonathan grinned at his friend. You're cutting into my dance time, man. Nick shrugged. Maybe that was the plan all around. He looked at me. I'll see if I can weasel you away for another song, he stated, and then turned and walked off the dance floor. I looked up at my dance partner, and he smiled down at me. Almost every guy in here wished they had the nerve that Nick has, that is. I laughed, and he turned to keep a bit out of Nick's view as he waved and taunted Jonathan from the bar around the floor. When the song ended, I stepped back and let out my breath as a faster song started up. He took my hand and we walked to the steps, where Nick stood smiling. She only dances slow songs, Jonathan laughed. Nick grinned. All the better. I'll come find you when the next one plays. He winked at me again and headed off towards a group that was standing off to the side watching him. Tanya headed our way. Come on, this is a great song, she shouted as the music got louder. I shook my head and backed up against Jonathan's chest. I can't dance. She grabbed my hand and dragged me out, with Jessica quickly following. I panicked and looked over, seeing Jonathan frown. He watched me closely for any signs that I did in fact want to be saved. I can do this, I thought to myself. Don't you dare be a baby. I try all kinds of new things with the pack. Tanya turned me so I was facing her. Watch me, she shouted, and I looked down and started to mimic her moves. Jessica stood next to me, and between the two of them I was able to pull it off and found out I wasn't a half-bad dancer. Tanya let out a yell, which was followed by many more, and she smiled at me. I laughed and then turned to see Nick on my other side. My eyes widened, and I looked to the sidelines. Your boyfriend can share a little of you, he laughed, and then moved in between me and Tanya. She frowned, but watched me closely and took up the other side. So I was dancing with 3 people, and I was actually starting to have fun. Joel and Allison danced over, and Joel gave me a look that said, You want me to get rid of that guy? I smiled and shook my head. He nodded, but stayed close. When the song was over, Tanya took my hand and turned to go. Nick took my other hand. Maybe you should ask her if she's done dancing, he laughed. Tanya turned, and her eyes were tight as she looked at him. Actually, I am done, I stated quickly, and pulled my hand away from him. Stupid dog, she hissed under her breath, and then shot me an apologetic look as we walked up the stairs. Michael and Ander were standing with Jonathan, who was the only one of them looking at me. I turned and followed my bodyguard's stare, and I sighed. It's okay, guys. He's just overly friendly. Tanya handed me over to her friend and smiled at me. You did great out there, she laughed, as if she weren't ready to fight a werewolf a moment ago. Thanks to you, I chuckled, and she shrugged. That's what friends are for. Then she turned and headed off towards a small group that was waving her over. I stepped up to the shiny metal bar around the dance floor and smiled. I think Allison and Joel hit it off. Jonathan stood next to me, one arm on the bar. He nodded. I would say so, he chuckled. When the next song finished, I watched the 2 join hands and head off the floor. Jonathan turned to them when they walked up, and Allison was beaming, her eyes telling me that she had a lot to talk about when we got back to the manor. Jonathan's phone went off, and we all turned to him as he pulled it out and glanced down at it. Then he pushed a button and put it back in his pocket. It can wait, he smiled at me, and I grinned. Just then Michael walked up and tapped his watch. We have to go? I whined. I didn't know we had a time limit. He shook his head, and Jonathan nodded, taking my hand. The three of us walked back behind the actual bar and through a door. Then Michael pulled a black bag off his shoulder, leaving me to wonder if he had worn that all night. He produced my thermos, and I looked around, but the cooks were turned the other way. "I'm fine," I stated as he checked the readout and then unscrewed the top. "And I plan to keep it that way," he said in his deep voice as he handed it to me. I rolled my eyes and took it, drinking it down quickly. I handed it back, and Jonathan smiled. "So, back to the dance floor?" I nodded, and he laughed. "I think I may have created a party girl." I huffed playfully, and we walked back out. I heard a commotion and turned. There was a group of people near the front door. Michael immediately stepped in front of me and lifted his phone to his ear. Jonathan took my hand and pulled me towards the stairs. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to twist around as we went up, but Michael's massive body blocked my view. "What about Allison?" I called out, and Jonathan pulled out his phone, pushed a button, and held it to his ear. When we reached the top, he pulled me past the sitting area and towards a small door in the back. When we got inside, I looked around. It was a plain room. The walls were thick enough to block out the music. There were 2 couches and a few big chairs. He walked me over to the couch. I looked at it. "What's happening?" "Just somebody getting a bit stupid," he stated, his face tight. "It'll be over in a minute." "Allison, what about Allison?" I asked him. "I'm right here." I turned to see her and Joel walking in, her eyes as wide as mine. She walked over to me and then turned to the men. "What's going on?" I whispered. She shrugged. "I don't know. There was some yelling, and then Joel grabbed me, and we were headed to the kitchen when he got the call, and we came up here." Tanya, Jessica, Drake, and Lucas ran in, their eyes locking on me, and then sighing in relief. Andrew appeared at the door, nodded to Michael, and stood, blocking the open doorway. "Is this really necessary?" I asked. Jonathan looked at me. "Of course it is. If one hair of your head is harmed, your father would destroy me, and your pack would take whatever was left." Then he chuckled as I wrinkled my nose at him. Then another phone rang, playing an odd tune that I almost recognized. Jonathan frowned and pulled my phone out of his pocket. He looked down at it. "There's no way he could know," he hissed, and started to push some buttons. I tried to look over his shoulder, but he winked at me and turned. "Is that track?" He nodded, and I sighed. These two really needed to learn to get along. Finally, Michael's phone went off, then Anders and Jonathan's, all at the same time. I watched them all put their phones to their ears, and Michael nodded and shoved his back in the holster. "All clear," Jonathan stated, and Ander moved away from the door. We stepped out, and the music started to play again. I started towards the railing, but Jonathan took my hand and pulled me to the couch. We all sat, and Allison quickly became animated and started to talk about the people she saw and how some of them, that had not been very nice to her before, were now trying to be her best friends. She smiled at me and lifted her chin a little. I told him that spot was already taken. I balked, my face going blank, but she nodded and then turned to Joel. "I can't believe their nerve. The last time I was here, they acted like they didn't even know me." "Not to worry, babe," Joel stated seriously. "No one will treat you that way with me around." Tanya chuckled, but I smiled. Allison was beaming, and she was very happy. I liked that. Joel seemed nice enough, too. When she looked at me, I nodded, and she slipped her arm through his. Chapter 8. Allison and Joel finally stood up and headed back downstairs. I watched them with my eyes, and Jonathan noticed. "For someone who said they didn't know how to dance, you seem to enjoy it a lot," he teased. I shrugged. "It's not so bad." He stood and held his hand out. I took it and stood. The rest of the gang followed us downstairs, and we all headed to the dance floor. Jonathan was a pretty good dancer, and we were laughing and talking, even though we had to lean into each other's ears to be heard. After 3 more songs, the music slowed, and he pulled me closer to him. My eyes scanned the floor, half expecting Nick to show up, but he didn't. I put my arms around his neck and then got a little brave and laid my head on his shoulder. He pulled me closer and put his arms around me. This was so much better than being locked away in the manor. I wonder what it felt like to be free to do this sort of thing whenever I wanted. The song ended way too soon, but Jonathan held me to him even when the music picked up. I pulled back a little and chuckled. I could always have them play another slow one, he stated, glancing up. I looked up and saw a booth with a guy that was watching us. I shook my head. No, let the rest of them have some fun. He took my hand and pulled me off the floor. Jessica walked over to us. Hey guys, mind if I bail early? Jonathan looked past her to a guy standing there looking a little nervous. He eyed her and she shrugged. You know, Rick, she stated, and finally he nodded. She hugged us both and looked at me. You're going to come out and do things with us more often, she said, and then turned and walked towards the other guy. Jonathan gave him a hard look and then turned back to me. Wow, are you her bodyguard too? I teased. He chuckled. In a way. I've known these guys a long time. She's like a sister to me. But Rick is okay, and he knows what would happen to him. I frowned, but shook my head and turned to watch the people on the dance floor. Finally, people started to leave, slowly picking up their things, saying goodbye to others, and heading towards the front door. I didn't wear a watch, but Jonathan pulled out his phone. It's 3:00. We better head back. I sighed and nodded. He grinned at me. There are other things to do besides coming to a club. I'm going to have to show you what life outside that manor is like. We gathered up the rest of the troop and headed towards the front. When we got outside, we saw groups of people standing around chatting. The cars were still parked at the curb, and we climbed in, one short, as Jessica had left earlier. When we pulled away from the curb, I leaned up to the window and watched it disappear. Finally, I smiled and sat back. Joel and Aunt Allison were snuggled up across from me, and I leaned my head back against the seat. My phone went off again, and I thought Jonathan was going to break it as he yanked it out of his pocket. Maybe I'd better get one of those purses, or I might just lose another phone. He looked down at it, then pushed a bunch of buttons. Track? He nodded and I smiled. I hope everything is okay. It will be. Do you know what kept him in Polson? I asked. He looked at me. I wasn't talking about that. I eyed him hard and he smiled. The ride home seemed longer, and I was actually glad when I saw the gates lift. It was great getting out, but this place did bring peace and comfort to me. Funny that I hadn't realized that before. I could see the orange light on the dash as we drove into the garage. When I hopped out, Jonathan put his hand on my back and we walked into the manor. The others were chatting away behind us, and Jonathan stopped and turned. I'm going to see Reina to her room. I'll catch up with you guys in a few minutes. Tanya frowned. I thought we could stay up all night and see what else is in that game room. I went to speak, but Jonathan shook his head. Reina can't stay up as long as we can. I frowned. Great. Go and make me look like a freak. Allison nodded. She can stay up maybe 2 nights at the most. I knew he was trying to be helpful and also exert her new friend label, but it wasn't helping. Tanya stepped up and hugged me. Okay then, I'll see you tomorrow. I'm glad you're all staying, I stated honestly. Drake laughed. We are here for a few days, to help you have some fun. Well, you're off to a good start, I chuckled. Then Allison hugged me tightly. Jonathan took my hand and he pointed the way to the game room. The others headed off and he turned and walked me down the hall. At one point, I stopped, bent down, and took my shoes off. "They hurt your feet?" he asked, concerned. "No, they're actually pretty comfortable, but I've been wearing them for a long time." He nodded and we walked up the stairs. My wolf guards were waiting and Michael and Anders stepped up to them, where they started to talk quietly. We stopped in front of my bedroom and Jonathan turned to me. "So tell me the truth. Don't spare my feelings." I pursed my lips. "Well," I stated, then shrugged. "I guess I had a pretty good time." He laughed. "Well, I'm glad. Tomorrow night I'll take you back into town. No club," he stated when I looked up at him. "There are other things to do there." I wanted to ask what, but he shook his head. "You'll just have to wait to see." I shrugged and then put my hand on my doorknob. Suddenly my stomach tightened. This was the point in all the movies where the guy kissed the girl. I swallowed hard and he leaned down and kissed my cheek. I grinned and he winked. "I know to go slow with you, Reina. I'm in no hurry and I'm not going anywhere." I blinked and looked at him, then walked into my room and shut my door. I stood there for a minute, settling my nerves, and then I walked over and put the shoes on the floor near my dressing table. The mess we had made earlier had been cleaned, and I headed to the bathroom. "Have a good time?" came a voice, and I actually jumped. I inhaled and smiled. It was all right. The curtains on my bed pulled back and he peeked out, then looked me over. I fidgeted under his stare and he stepped out, dressed only in his shorts. "Wow," he stated, and I rolled my eyes. He walked over and then circled me. "You clean up pretty nicely there, wolf girl." "Shut up," I chuckled, moving to my dresser to grab my pajamas. When I looked back at him, he had his arms crossed and seemed deep in thought. I wrinkled my nose. "What?" "Nothing. Hurry up, I'm tired," he stated, and turned. I huffed and went into the bathroom. When I came out, I walked quietly to the bed, figuring he would be asleep like he usually was. But he turned and looked at me. He was lying on his back with his hands tucked under his head. He threw back the cover and I slid in. Then he rolled onto his side and looked at me. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No," he stated. "Well, why are you just staring at me?" "I'm not." "Yes, you are," I chuckled. "Okay, maybe I am." "Well, why?" "I have no idea. You are a very strange wolf, Track." He chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." He laid back down, then grunted and reached under his back. He pulled Wolfie out and looked at him. "Sorry, guy, but this spot is taken." Then he tossed the wolf on the foot of the bed. "Hey, careful with him!" I shot. "Why? You have a real wolf here now." He pulled me to him and I snuggled up on his chest and closed my eyes. Track stroked my hair and I drifted quickly. When he woke up later, he reached for my wrist and played with the charm bracelet. Finally, he slipped out from under me. I stirred and he sat on the edge of the bed. I felt him staring and blinked open my eyes. He smiled at me and handed me Wolfie. I took the stuffed animal and then eyed him sleepily. "Is everything okay?" I asked when he just kept looking at me. "Yeah, it's fine." I propped myself up a bit. "Something's wrong." He shook his head. "No, now go back to sleep." I frowned, and he put a hand on my forehead and pushed me back to the pillow. "Go to sleep," he chuckled. "Are you coming back tonight?" He sighed. "I don't know. You have a house full." "They're nice, and that shouldn't stop you." When he didn't respond, I frowned. "Can you bring Rock and Jackson?" I offered. He looked at me, then finally stood. "Maybe I will." Track leaned over and kissed my forehead. Go to sleep, Snow White, he chuckled, and I grinned. He pulled his sweatpants on, left the room, and nodded to the wolves outside, then headed down the stairs. At the bottom, he turned, hearing laughter coming from the game room. He glared, but headed towards the garage. As he passed, Jonathan stepped out. The two looked at each other, and then Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. Yeah, I know. She doesn't like to sleep alone. Track shrugged. She is part wolf. We don't like to sleep alone. It's a pack thing you wouldn't understand. I may not like it, but I do understand the concept, Jonathan stated quietly. But she may not have to worry about sleeping alone much longer. Track's lip pulled back and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Jonathan stepped up closer. Reina may be 1/4 wolf, but the other 3/4 of her are vampire. Your point? Just making a statement. Thanks for pointing that out. I'll be back later tonight. Jonathan shrugged. I'm taking her out, so you may want to come early. Early in vampire terms, that is. Where are you taking her now? To the city. Does her father know? Jonathan nodded and Track shook his head. You're going to get her hurt. It's not safe out there for her. She's safe with me. Nothing will happen to her. Make sure it doesn't. Jonathan chuckled. Or what? You'll kill me? No, but remember, she is part of the largest pack in the States. With that, Track turned and nearly stomped the rest of the way to the garage. And that's where I'm going to end that one.